Hello and welcome to another episode of Brothers Creed Podcast. We're talking about motivation, experiences, and exploring the world around us. We're the Thomas Brothers. I'm Ethan.
And I'm Jared, and today we're talking about infamous hostage situations. Some you may have heard of, and some you haven't heard of. These hostage situations and negotiations are a fascinating thing, and so we kind of dive into some of these ones and from history and learn what we can learn from them, and also maybe some good things that came out of them, and some bad things that came out of them. So it's going to be an interesting episode. So let's go ahead and jump in.
All right, let's do it.
Spartans! What is your profession?
Any man who must say, I am the king, is no true king.
What I do have are a very particular set of skills. Skills that make me a nightmare.
If I can change, and you can change, everybody can change!
Let us all unite! Let us fight for a new world, a decent world.
Okay, so one of the interesting things I was looking at is just like hostage situations happen across the board. But when you talk about globally, there's some interesting patterns that emerge. So one thing I looked at is the top countries, the top hostage-taking countries. First, we've got China, Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela. Those are the most countries with the highest hostages that they take. And when you talk about nationalities, I found this one chart. It says nationalities of murdered Western hostages. 45% of them are U.S. citizens, 15% are United Kingdom citizens, and 40% are other nationalities. So if you're a U.S. citizen,
Almost half of them.
Are from the U.S.
That's because Americans are rich. You didn't know that?
Yeah, and also the U.S., well, historically, in years past, I don't know about years recent, based off of one of the things I will tell you about, they did not negotiate with terrorists. And so oftentimes that was a deterrent from taking American hostages. But as I will talk about later, in recent years, recent meaning since the 2000s, there has been government negotiation with terrorists and payments to terrorists. So talk about that. Another thing that was interesting is that the number of worldwide kidnappings due to terrorism from 2007 to 2020. I'm an analyst. I love charts and stuff. Interesting. So the chart here in 2008, it was up to 2007, 8. They were around 4,000 kidnappings worldwide from terrorism. 2009 sprung up to about almost 11,000. And then back down to the 6,000, 5,000 level. 2012, a low, since was at 1,283. And then from there, it almost skyrockets all the way up. In 2016, there were 15,600-ish kidnappings. And then it comes down from there. In 2017, down to 8,000. And then now we're around the 3,000 to 4,000 level of hostages taken per year. So interesting.
So why the spike?
I don't know. I think in 2009 is probably correlated with the financial crisis. 2016, I don't know what would cause that. Any ideas?
No, I don't know. I mean, kind of the recession around 2008, 2009 would make sense, potentially. And then I'm just trying to think what
Probably some kind of foreign diplomacy, likely. I think
it
it's
might
likely
have to do
associated
with
with like foreign policy and like some of these countries, being open. 2016 was was this big issue with Iran, and we were trying to do this this deal around the nuclear, uranium refinements and stuff like that. So
I wonder if it like relates to years that they have like the Olympics and stuff like that. I know that like the year that the Olympics was in Brazil, I think there was like a record number of kidnappings and stuff during that time period. And then,
oh wow, yeah, that's so lots of foreigners are traveling to those countries, and you get the cartels and the favelas, and they come up and snatch you.
Yeah. I don't know. Interesting. But yeah, so Jared and I, we actually both just read this book. It was called Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. And the whole book is he is a former head of negotiations for the FBI. I can't remember his exact title, but he wrote this book called Never Split the Difference. And he's talking about negotiating with in lots of different situations, anything from like buying a car to putting your kid to bed to negotiating with hostage situations and terrorists. And he gives a lot of cool, kind of little interesting tidbits, like how to negotiate and mirroring and specific things to say and to get other people to say during a negotiation. But one thing that I thought was really interesting is he goes in and he talks about, I can't remember what decade it was. It might have been the 90s um, but apparently the FBI got involved a lot with some kidnappings that were happening in Haiti. And he said that there was one point where in Haiti, there was like 7 to 10 kidnappings a day they were going on. That it was just incredible how, I don't say much corruption or crime or whatever it might be, but these people were getting kidnapped and then they were being held for ransom. And the FBI would get involved, not particularly because these were U.S. citizens that were being kidnapped, but they were maybe politicians or family members of politicians and things like that, and the U.S. would get involved. And so it was just so interesting that they would kidnap the son of a businessman in Haiti, right? Just some thugs would, and they would send a ransom and say, we want $500,000. And he said he got to a point to where they negotiated so many of these ransoms that he actually ended up kind of finding a pattern of what these people actually wanted. And they wanted $500,000, but that's not what they really wanted. After negotiation and basically talking them down, the family is like, well, I don't have $500,000 that I can pay these these kidnappers. And so the family would say, we have $10,000 we could pay. And so he would negotiate with the kidnappers and say, oh, well, how do you expect the family? How are they supposed to pay that much money? And then, they get it down. They'd say, okay, well, $200,000. And then they get it down and say, $50,000. And they get it down. And it got to a point to where, obviously it's a serious situation, but he said it almost became a game to see how low they could get these these kidnappers down on their negotiations, on their ransoms. Because he said in the end, really all they wanted was they wanted party money
for the weekend.
They wanted party money for the weekend, and that was it. And so, he got to the point where they would say, we want, $300,000 ransom for this person. And he'd be like, how about $2,167.58. And then they're like, I don't know, and then they'd push back. And then he'd even say, well, how about we throw in a DVD player for each one of you guys? And then they'd be like, we don't want the DVD player, but we'll take, $3,868, or something like that. And they'd be like, okay, all right. And so it was just kind of interesting, the whole premise of never split the difference with I guess negotiating with terrorists is, if you're in a negotiation and you have a terrorist that has 4 people and is holding them hostage, or maybe a bank heist that they've got hostages inside. I mean, what does splitting the difference look like? Does splitting the difference say, okay, give us 2 hostages and then you can keep 2 hostages?
Yeah.
I mean, that's not
it's unacceptable.
There's no difference to split there.
Yeah.
And so really good read. Actually, I was even thinking about it. I was like, man, I might listen to that one again, just kind of on 2x speed, just to pound through it and listen to it again. But
Yeah, that is a good one. I enjoyed listening. Well, I've listened to about, I think most of it. I think I have about an hour and a half left to listen to it. But it's been really good so far. I find myself trying to mirror people and use some of his tactics as well, just to get people to talk.
yeah,
Those are cool. One of the most crazy hostage situations that I've heard of, and it's actually an infamous thing, and this happened not right before I was born. It happened before I was born, about 10 years before I was born. So I just missed this whole thing, and I never really learned about it. I had heard about it. There's a movie about it, but I never really knew what exactly happened, and then how that ties into something that's happened recently during the Obama administration. But I want to talk about the Iranian hostage crisis. Hey, Ethan, have you ever heard about this?
I have. I think I might have seen a little bit of the movie on it one time, but can't remember any of the details.
So let me tell you, give you the background. So it's in the fall of 1978, and this is during the Jimmy Carter administration. So there was a lot of, at the time, the president of Iran was kind of a U.S. puppet, you could say. His name was Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. I'll just refer to him as Shah. And that president, he was in a situation where the country was trying to revolt against them. And there were lots of protests. At the embassy because they were fighting against Americans for being way too involved and meddling in their affairs of their country. And the U.S. doesn't really have a good track record of maintaining peaceful relations and having puppet governments, especially in Muslim-dominated states. Our country.
Well, it's interesting. I think the Iran in that time period, I think, was a very kind of progressive country. They had quite a bit of freedom, before some of these revolutions and things happened that changed the whole trajectory of the country. But
yes, I didn't dig too much into that exactly. I mainly just looked at the hostage situation because it was very long and intense. But because of all this upheaval and stuff, the U.S. Embassy reduced its staff from about 1,400 people to 70 people. And so when this was happening, that President Shah, he had cancer, and he said, "Oh, I need to come to the U.S. to get some procedures done." And they're like, "What procedures?" And he's just like, "I just got to get some stuff done." So it wasn't clear if he was just trying to flee the country or if he actually needed help. He did have cancer, though. And so he came to the U.S., and that was a big no-no. So about a month later, in November of 1979, about 3,000 protesters stormed the embassy, and they took 63 Americans hostage. And then another 3 were captured at the Iranian Foreign Ministry because these people were very upset with the Americans, and they thought, "Oh, now the Americans are hiding this guy and whatnot." And there was another president who had come out of like exile, I guess you could call it, and he was acting as the. He said that basically, you got to give us Shah back, and we will release the hostages. So, aside from the 66 that were captured, there were 6 Americans who were able to escape the embassy siege and sought help with the Canadian embassy. And I'll talk about those 6 in just a minute. So the request was on November 12th, so just a few days after the raid of the taking of the hostages, the Iranian foreign minister indicated that these hostages would be released if the United States ceased interfering with Iranian affairs, and if the old President Shah was returned to Iran for trial, and if the assets in the possession of the Shah were declared stolen property. So that was the demand. So the U.S. response, they tried to do all kinds of stuff. They did a variety of things to squeeze Iran, try to negotiate with the hostages. They refused to purchase Iranian oil. I think that caused I'm pretty sure that caused like an Iranian oil, because of that embargo, like gas prices skyrocketed here in the 80s, during that time, 78 and early 80s. They froze billions of dollars in Iranian assets in the U.S. They were on like a vigorous international diplomacy campaign to get these hostages released. They got two UN Security Council resolutions against Iran. They filed suit against the Iranian government in an international court of justice, which they won. The consensus of the international community basically was that these hostages need to be released. They were in favor of the United States, and many diplomats from other countries went to Iran to say, "Hey, you guys got to let these people go, and this is enough." But really, there were so many revolutionaries, and there wasn't really a clear leader at the time. So there wasn't really a clear person to negotiate with to release these hostages, and they didn't really know who had the power to release them. So that was kind of one of the difficult pieces. They did release a few hostages fairly quickly. There was 13 hostages, all women or African Americans, on the grounds that they were unlikely to be spies. And another hostage was released because he was gravely ill. And that was in July. He was released on July 11th, 1980. So then there was...
It was 2 years. 2 years after.
Yeah, so he was the guy who was ill was released on July 11th. The 13 that were released, I think they were released pretty soon after November 17th. So I think that's actually possibly a few days after they were captured. But there were still 52 hostages. Later, so this whole thing lasted 440 days with these main hostages. So it lasted a while. And at one point, the U.S. tried to do like a military operation to get these guys out. So the hostages were being held at the U.S. Embassy still. And the operation was an absolute failure. It was like such an egg on the face of America. It is just unbelievable. Which is funny because you kind of think about the parallels of this. And then when we went in to get Osama bin Laden, I'll read you what happened, and then I'll tell you the parallels in a second. So the operation was fraught with problems from the beginning. 2 of the 8 helicopters sent for the operation malfunctioned before arriving at the first staging area. Another broke down on site. Unable to complete their mission, the U.S. forces sought to withdraw, during which one of the remaining helicopters collided with the support aircraft. 8 U.S. service members were killed, and their bodies left behind were later paraded before the Iranian television cameras. So we ended up losing helicopters.
They didn't even get there.
No, they just crashed a helicopter. All these 8 soldiers ended up dying. They ended up parading them through the streets and in front of the TV cameras. It made me think of when they went to get Osama bin Laden. Didn't they have a helicopter, like some kind of top secret helicopter that they had to like scuttle and burn?
They had to blow up,
yeah,
because it had crashed or something.
Yeah, it was like a silent helicopter, something like that. I don't know, just crazy, total bungled. And then so that took away a lot of our leverage because they're like, oh, you guys are trying to force us now and trying to do all this stuff, trying to kill us. So they moved the hostages, and it was kind of back to square one at that point. And so I'll get back to what happens with all those folks later, but I want to talk about more the 6 escaped, the 6 hostages, the 6 U.S. citizens that were able to make it to the Canadian embassy and weren't taken captive. So they escaped, and they went to the Canadian ambassador named Ken Taylor, and he kept them in his house, and also one of the other Canadian dignitaries that was there. And they created fake passports for them while they were there. They were there from November to January of the next year. And there was, this was a very, high stress situation. The Iranian revolutionists knew that there had been some that had escaped, and so, or at least they thought they did. So they were going to try to find them. The Canadian embassy was like trying to get all of their people out. I think they had 850 people of their own embassy that they were trying to get out of the country. And one of the cool things that the article said is when the Americans sought help at the Canadian embassy, they responded, "Hell yes, of course, count on us." And I just love that. Like,
That's cool.
we're here to help you guys. If it was Justin Trudeau, he'd probably say, "No way." Who knows?
He'd probably say, "I have him over here. I have him over here."
Yeah, he's a communist himself, son of Fidel Castro. Anyway, that's a whole different thing. So the CIA operative named Tony Mendez, who's played by Ben Affleck in the movie, he is an expert in exfiltration, so getting people out of places that they don't want to be in. And so he cooked up a plan known as the Canadian Caper. A caper is like a dance, so the Canadian dance. And interesting, one of the things he talks about, he wrote a book called The Master of Disguise, and I have a quote here from it. He says, "A cover should be bland, as uninteresting as possible, so the casual observer or the not-so-casual immigrant official doesn't probe too deeply." He said that in his memoir about this. And he said his solution, the film gambit, was the opposite of bland, and an idea so bold he believed that Iran would never consider it might be a fake. So what he ended up doing is he had this bold idea to come up with a movie and say, "Oh, there is a movie script he found that called Argo," and he said this is a science fiction film, and what we're going to do is He ended up flying to Tehran. First of all, before he did that, he set up a production company. He met with people in Hollywood. They ran articles and like advertisements for Argo and several different magazines, and they got all this stuff ready. They got the scripts all ready, and he flew over there as the producer and like kind of location scout of the movie. And so he goes and talks to the Minister of Culture in Iran, and he says he's Canadian. Obviously, he was undercover. And it was interesting because he goes to the Canadian ambassador's house, and he tells everybody, "Hey, this is the plan." And they're like, "What? This is the exact opposite. We need to be low-key, Some people had suggested, "Oh, well, maybe they can ride bikes to the Turkish border." It's 300-mile bike ride. Like, how are they going to do that discreetly, So they had to fly out. The whole idea was to get them to fly out of the country. And so what he did is he gave everybody their scripts, and he had them memorize the parts or what they were going to do. There was someone who was a cameraman, someone who was a set designer, and they had to kind of research all this stuff so that they would be ready in case there was any type of interrogation at the airport. They would know their part, because if they broke, then everybody was dead. They knew that they were dead. And so on January 27th, 1980, the film crew navigated its way nervously through the airport and onto the morning flight to Frankfurt. Their fake paperwork worked out great, despite it being fake, obviously. And they were extremely nervous, obviously. And the plane was actually delayed an hour, so they're just sitting in the waiting room, waiting to be called up. And they're just like, "Oh my gosh!" And the revolutionaries are walking around, and they're just so nervous.
And this is just those 6 that had not escaped, but that had evaded the capture.
Yep. Plus Mendez, the CIA operative, and his partner, who went by Jose. And so it was interesting. One of the quotes from it, from this was, "And we went up the ramp to the aircraft. Bob Anders nudged me and said, 'You guys think of everything,' Mendez says. He pointed at the nose of the Swiss aircraft, and there, lettered across the nose, was the word Argo, spelled Aargau, which is just like Argo, right? The name of the film. Mm-hmm. Close enough to the good ship Argo. and we always look for some omen in this operation. There's some sign that tells you this is a good work, and that was the omen they were looking for. I thought that was funny. Mendez says that when the plane crossed the Iranian airspace, the Americans all busted up into cheers, and they started cheering and everything. And apparently other people on the airplane started cheering as well. They didn't know why they didn't know why these other people were cheering, but they're just like, yeah, we're out of our Tehran, because I think a lot of people just were anxious to get out. And so that was pretty interesting. Later that day, the Canadians shut down the embassy and left Iran. And what happened there is the U.S. government was like, oh, thank you, Canada. Thank you so much, Canada, for getting our guys out. You guys are so great. So this didn't come out. This was a CIA operation until many, many years later. In fact, Mendez was given like a medal for distinctive service in the CIA. They gave it to him, and then they took it back from him because it was a secret thing. And then, until this became public knowledge, and then they eventually fully gave him the medal. But they really blamed it on the Canadians. They're like, oh, thank you, Canada, for saving our guys, because they didn't want to lose any more leverage or negotiating power and make America seem even more like the bad guys. Of course, the movie made it more Hollywood. There's like a chase scene at the end, and they're in the airport, and then one of the guys like, what is this? And you guys are movie actors. And then like one of the guy like really, he had studied a lot of what the movie was about and what his part was supposed to be. So he kind of convinces them based off what the movie was about. So it's a little bit theatrical, but it was definitely nerve-wracking for those walking through the airport to do that. And
I'm sure.
So the release of the rest of the hostages in 1980, Iran officially installed a new government, which made negotiations more fruitful. A lot of stuff started happening, though. Iraq also invaded Iran, which put a lot of pressure on the country, especially when the whole globe was stopped trading with them, essentially. Most of the globe. The prime minister of Iran went to the UN asking for help from the world leaders, and they were like, you got to let those hostages go first. The Shah, that old president, he actually died in July of 1980 of cancer, so that kind of killed that bargaining chip. And then the Iranians demanded the release of Iranian assets, and an agreement was made January 20th, 1981, just minutes after Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as president. Apparently, this situation was a big deal in the presidential election between Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter. The rest of the prisoners were released after 440 days of being held captive. The U.S. unfroze $80 billion in frozen assets for Iran. So that's what happened with the Iranian hostage crisis. Now, there is a part 2 on this, and I want to talk to these back to back because they're all related in a way. So you may remember in 2016, the Obama administration was trying to negotiate with Iran to stop them from building nuclear facilities, nuclear bombs, basically refining their uranium and stuff like that. So with that, there was also 5 American hostages that Iran had. They had detained them, held them hostage. Potato. And so, so interesting, a little bit more of a backstory here. In the 1960s and 70s, when we had good relations with Iran, before this revolution, like I talked about, Iran was one of the largest partners of U.S. foreign military sales program. As an Obama administration official was explaining that as part of the FMS program, that a trust fund was established in which Iranian funds to pay U.S. contractors as work progressed on the various contracts. In February 1979, days before the culmination of the Iran's revolution, the United States and Iran agreed to a memorandum of understanding that halted these payments and voided many of the remaining purchases. The memorandum of understanding also called for Iran's unexpended funds to be placed in an interest-bearing account. So they had a bunch of money in this account, and we said, okay, let's pause this, and we're going to put this money in an interest-bearing account. And then the revolution happened, and everything just got paused, right? So Iran had put $600 million in this fund. Bush George W. Bush had paid $200 million in like the early 90s in an agreement with Iran. So about $400 million remained. So the Obama administration in this deal offered to give them $400 million that was left in the fund, plus an additional $1.3 billion that was interest. The original memorandum of understanding was supposed to be interest bearing. This money was supposed to be an interest bearing account. So from like the 70s to 2016. I mean, that's a lot of years, right?
Yeah.
Do you think that the United States put that money in an interest bearing account?
Probably not.
No, they did not. They did not. So,
but I'm sure they took out of their taxes account that we paid into taxes to pay their 1 billion dollars.
1.3. They absolutely did take it out of the taxpayers' accounts. This is how they did it. So there was in the Department of Finance, they have an account that is used for judgments or litigation against the government. So if I sue the government for something, you know how we talked about in the Bill of Rights, so there's remittances, or you can have judgments against the government, or you can go to the government for grievances, or remittance of grievances, I think was called. And they will pay you out if you've been wronged. And so the government does not allow any single claim to be paid out over 10 digits. So what they did in order to get around that law, because they were using this in a way that it wasn't supposed to be used, they did 13 claims of $99,999,999.99 and one claim of $10,390,236.28 to get around that law that said you can't have more than one claim. And also, guess what? This doesn't need congressional approval. So easily, let's just give these guys $1.3 billion in cash. That's how they delivered it, in cash. So what they did is they wired this money to Swiss banks, and they converted it into mostly Swiss francs and euros. And then they delivered pallets, $1.3 billion in pallets of cash to the Iranian government, which, by the way, has been labeled along with 4 other countries as state sponsor of. So the government labels countries that where the state or the country sponsors terrorism. There are 4 that the U.S. government has labeled as these countries are paying for terrorism: North Korea, Cuba, Syria, and Iran. Iran has been labeled like that since 1984, after all this revolution stuff.
And Obama gave them $1.7 billion.
1.3. Well, we gave them 1.7, including the $400 million of that was, and so 1.7 in total. And they called it, the Obama administration called it they said, well, it's not a ransom payment. It's technically a reciprocating humanitarian gesture.
Yeah.
That's what they called it. The State Department officials testified that the payment was briefly halted over concerns about one of the whereabouts of the relatives of one of the released prisoners. The administration maintains that the pause was not linked to the cash transaction, but was the prudent thing to do. So they said, oh, wait, you're not going to give us the hostages that we need? Well, we're going to hold the cash for a second. Okay, you found the hostages that we need? Okay, now we're going to give you the cash. So it's not a hostage. It wasn't a ransom payment. So, like, how can you say it wasn't a ransom payment when literally you're pausing the payment until you make sure that the hostages get released? So there was a video that was, I think, posted online of literally one of these pallets of cash. And the Iranians are like, yeah, they're dancing around. Thank you, America. Death to America. You know, like these guys are chanting death to America this whole time.
Now we can build a bunch of jungle gyms so that our terrorists can train in their camps.
Oh my gosh. So this is, I thought that was interesting because it all kind of comes full circle, and you need the context of that Iranian revolution, the Iranian hostage crisis, and then now this money going back to them. I mean, technically, this was some of their money from when they were a good country. But one of the things you have to consider, and we said we had an agreement that there had to be interest-bearing accounts, but people in the United States have grievances against Iran, and they can sue Iran. So there are people in the United States that have millions and millions and millions of dollars in grievances outstanding from Iran, and if the U.S. seizes any of their assets, then it's meant to go pay out these people, right? And so we are giving Iran all of this money while the U.S. citizens have these outstanding multi-millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, possibly more than that, in outstanding claims against the Iranian government. But now that we're giving them all these assets, now the U.S. just, it just kind of well, I guess the U.S. has to pay.
We lost the leverage.
Yeah, or the U.S. has to pay these claims now, or these people just won't get their money. And these are money from claims oh, you took my brother hostage and killed him, so I'm going to sue you for this much in an international court. It's okay, yeah, that country has to pay you that much. And so the U.S., if they seize a warship from Iran, and they can sell, or they seize a bunch of money, they would give part of that money to the claims of people who have against that country. So that was another one of the major things that was a big deal with that. So anyway, that was an interesting story.
Yeah, well, I thought it was cool kind of how they tied together, right?
Yeah.
How kind of one really kind of played into the other.
Can you imagine $1.7 billion in cash?
In
How much?
cash.
That's like a warehouse full of cash. It's crazy.
Yeah, no. To answer that question, no, I cannot imagine $1.4 billion in cash.
Yeah, what was it on Breaking Bad when he's he's got the duffel bag? He's like, "What's in that duffel bag? This is heavy." And he's like, $500,000 in cash. And that's just $500,000. You multiply that by what?
A lot, millions.
I mean, can you imagine how heavy that would be? You probably fill a stadium. You probably fill the floor of a football stadium, 10 feet high or something. I don't know how the dimensions of it exactly, but it would be a lot.
Well, it depends on if you're using $100 bills or $1 bills.
You're using Swiss francs, so I don't know what denomination of Swiss francs and euros that they have.
So the one that I kind of latched onto and dug into is not your average hostage situation. This hostage taker, right, was described to be calm, polite, and very well spoken.
Oh, John Q.
So, yeah. So, this is the story of the infamous D.B. Cooper.
Ooh, nice.
So, on Thanksgiving Eve, November 24th of 1971, a middle-aged man identified himself as Dan Cooper and used cash to purchase a one-way ticket on Flight 305, which is a 30-minute trip north from Seattle to Tacoma International Airport. So he gets on the plane. He bought the ticket in cash with the name Dan Cooper. Gets on the plane, sits down, has a drink, bourbon and soda. And then shortly after takeoff, Cooper reached into his bag. He had a black briefcase with him, reached into his bag and handed a note to the flight attendant who was seated in the jump seat nearest to him, and handed her this note folded over, and handed it to her and just kind of went back to looking out the window. This flight attendant, her last name of Schaffner, she just kind of assumed that it was some lonely middle-aged businessman in a suit that was giving her his phone number. So she just kind of put it in her purse, this folded up piece of paper, put it in her purse without even looking at it. So he kind of looks back over to her, and he leans over and he whispers to her, "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb."
Oh, man.
And So he directed her to come and sit in the seat next to him. Schaffner, the flight attendant, she requested to see the bomb, which I don't know if that's like training or something like that, but she said she requested to see the bomb. And he opened up his briefcase just long enough for her to get a glimpse of 8 red cylinders in 2 rows of 4 and assumed it to be dynamite. It says a wire was attached to the cylinders and a large cylinder battery was in the briefcase as well. So after closing the briefcase, he stated his demands. His demands were he wanted $200,000 and in American currency, unmarked bills, and 4 parachutes. 2 primary parachutes and 2 reserve parachutes, and a fuel tank standing by in Seattle to refuel the aircraft upon arrival. So the flight attendant, she got up and she went and she conveyed this message to the pilot and the instructions to the pilot in the cockpit. And when she returned, DB Cooper was wearing dark black sunglasses, and that he wore for the whole rest of the trip.
I wear my sunglasses at night. Go ahead.
So the captain, William A. Scott, he contacted the Seattle Tacoma Airport air traffic control and informed them what was going on, the local and federal authorities. There were 35 other passengers on this plane other than DB Cooper. Mm-hmm. And the captain came over the intercom and told the other passengers that their arrival in Seattle would be delayed because of a minor mechanical difficulty. That's what the captain told the rest of the passengers over the intercom. Uh-huh. So the Northwest Orient, which that was the name of the airline. Mm-hmm. So the Northwest Orient's president, his name was Donald Nerup. He authorized the payment of the ransom and ordered all employees to cooperate fully with the hijackers' demands.
So the airline is paying the ransom.
Yeah. So that's who the ransom was for, right? Or that's who it was asked to, I guess. The aircraft circled around the Puget Sound for approximately 2 hours while the Seattle police and the FBI had enough time to assemble these parachutes that he wanted and for them the airline to gather this ransom money and for them to mobilize all the emergency personnel and everything they had. So Schaffner, the flight attendant, described Cooper as calm, polite, and well-spoken, which was not consistent with the stereotypical kind of enraged, hardened criminals that would just yell, "Take me to Cuba," and just be disrespectful and threatening to kill everybody. And he was just very quiet and silent. He never was cruel. She said he was never cruel or nasty. He was thoughtful and calm all the time. As Schaffner grasped the enormity of what was happening, Cooper continually reassured her. He ordered a second bourbon and soda, paid his drink tab, and attempted to leave a generous tip.
Attempted to leave a generous tip?
Yeah, I don't know what that means.
I would put $10 on this receipt, but the pen doesn't work, so sorry, no tip.
Yeah, the pen doesn't work. So one of the flight attendants asked Cooper why he had such a grudge against the Northwest Orient, which was the airline company. He said, "I don't have a grudge against the airline, miss. I just have a grudge." That's what he said.
Yeah.
So the FBI assembled all the ransom money and from several banks around there in the Seattle area, and they gathered 10,000 unmarked $20 bills with the serial numbers beginning with the letter L, and they they were able to kind of write down all the list of all the serial numbers and everything else.
That would take
that was
forever,
part of
dude.
there. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe there's a machine or something that. Yeah, I don't
What
know.
year was
Maybe
this? What year was this?
This was 71.
There likely wasn't a machine that.
Yeah, I don't know.
Anyway, yeah.
But so this was 1971. So this is $200,000, which basically is the equivalent of $1.3 million in today's money.
Oh, okay.
Um,
You need a parachute
so-
just for the money. In
yeah,
today's money.
seriously. So they got him all the money, and they got him 4 parachutes, but they were actually military issued parachutes that that had an automatic deploy system on the parachute that as soon as you jump, the ripcord would pull. And he actually rejected the military issued parachutes and instead demanded 4 civilian parachutes that had manually operated ripcords. And so the Seattle police were like scrambling around, and finally they found a skydiving school, local skydiving school, that had 4 spare parachutes that they took from the skydiving school and gave to him. So they landed in Seattle, or they landed in
Tacoma.
Tacoma, and he instructed the pilot to take the plane to a certain area of the tarmac, right, and kind of line it up to take off. And the president of the airline actually showed up, and he was wearing civilian clothing. He didn't want to wear like his pilot's uniform or whatever, or whatever the uniform is, because he didn't want to look like a police officer. So he showed up, and he brought 2 duffel bags full of cash along with the 4 parachutes, and took him to the plane. And Cooper let all 35 passengers go, but he obviously maintained the crew on the plane. And so they went and they started fueling. The fueling process was delayed. They had to bring like 3 or 4 fueling trucks, and Cooper was getting really kind of upset about what was happening because it was taking so long.
Because they were intentionally stalling, I'm sure.
Yeah, and so he sent them a note saying that this shouldn't be taking so long, and then finally sent him another note to say when he was like, "That's enough gas." He basically sent him a note. He said, "Let's get this show on the road." Is the note, the handwritten note that he sent the people, I guess, through the steward or through the flight attendant to the police. So Cooper, they got on the plane and they went and they took off again. And he basically instructed the whole crew to get inside the cockpit as they started flying south towards Mexico City, is where they were going. And
from Washington,
so, from Washington. So they took off, and everybody was supposed to remain in the cockpit with the curtains closed. At approximately 8 p.m., a warning light flashed in the cockpit, indicating that there was the Air Star apparatus had been activated. I think that's kind of like an internal airplane intercom. And the pilot came over the intercom of the plane to see if Cooper was there or okay, or what if he needed something, if he needed assistance. And Cooper just picked up the phone in the cabin and replied back in one word. He said, "No." That was the last message that anyone heard from Cooper. After that,
So how did you open the door or something? How do you open the door inside the airplane?
Well, you can open the door, right? So
the pressure is so hot. Well, it depends on how high they're flying, I guess.
Well, a little bit. So they were flying low. They were flying at like 3,000 feet. So it wasn't like 30,000 feet like these commercial airliners do, whatever. That was part of the stipulation. So the jump was shortly after he replied, "No, I don't need any help." The crew felt a very distinctive change in the air pressure of the plane. and that was basically indicating that a door had been opened. One of the rear doors had been opened.
Yeah.
And they, after they felt that, they waited a little while and then opened the curtain, and he was gone. He had jumped with the money and 2 parachutes, and then he had left 2 parachutes in the plane, which he had opened and kind of like cut the cords so they were inoperable. I don't know why he would have done that, but and he was gone. So he jumped out somewhere over they don't know exactly. I mean, they he parachuted out somewhere over southwestern Washington is what they know. That's all the information that they had. Now the airline actually they set up a reward that they were going to pay 15% of any money that was returned for a maximum of $25,000.
Yeah.
So, if you returned, $100,000 of that money, then you get 15 grand. And in 1972, the U.S. government, they actually released all of the serial numbers of the bills that were part of that $200,000. And there were 2 men that they took advantage of this, and they actually counterfeited they counterfeited a bunch of $20 bills with those serial numbers. And they swindled a reporter into thinking that that one of the guys was DB Cooper. And they used those counterfeit bills with those serial numbers as proof to this reporter. And so they swindled this reporter out of $30,000. They said, "Oh, if you pay me $30,000, then I will, do an interview with you, and I'll do all this kind of stuff." And they showed him the money, and they showed him the counterfeit money, and he believed him, paid him $30,000, and then they disappeared.
Oh man!
So kind of interesting. Another really
that's we should have talked about on our Colin episode.
Yeah. In 1980, so this was 9 years later, actually, a small portion of the ransom money was found along the banks of the Colorado River. So there was a bunch of money that was found, and I guess somebody found it and turned it in, and it was the serial numbers matched the serial numbers for some of this ransom money.
No way.
And so this kind of re-triggered a whole renewal of interest in
along the Colorado River. That's a ways away.
Yeah. So
that's a long ways away from southern Washington. Yeah,
and so it just kind of sparked the mystery of what happened to DB Cooper and everything else, which we all know that he ended up in prison with Michael Scofield, right?
Yeah, from Prison Break.
Yeah, it's Prison Break reference. So really, they have no idea what happened. The whole thing really kind of remains a mystery. And actually, did you ever see the movie Without a Paddle as well?
Yeah.
Where it's like the boy, all the young friends, they all dreamed about finding DB Cooper's money, and they, whenever they grew up, they went on this adventure to try to find it, and they found out that he had fallen in a hole and broken his leg, and he burned the money to try to stay alive, you know, but I mean, that was all made up. But what was interesting to me is that in 2016, the FBI finally suspended the active investigation in the DB Cooper case.
Oh, wow.
In 2016. I mean, that was like 6 years ago.
Yeah, that's crazy.
I mean, this happened in 1971.
So that money's been spent.
Yeah, that money's long gone. So I don't know.
It's kind of like those guys who escaped.
You're listening to the podcast. Reach out to us.
Yeah, we'd love to have you on.
It's kind of
like those guys who escaped from Alcatraz, right? Never heard from them again. So maybe they lived, maybe they didn't.
That is true. Maybe they hooked up with DB Cooper.
Maybe. That's an interesting one. That's a classic. One of the ones I wanted to talk about, the one hostage situation, and this one's kind of a tragedy. and something I had never heard of, but this is called the Moscow Theater Hostage Crisis. You ever heard of this?
Mm-mm.
So the Moscow Theater Hostage Crisis, also known as the 2002 Allstay siege, because that was the name of the play, was a seizure of a crowded Moscow theater on October 23rd, 2002, by about 40 to 50 armed Chechnyan rebel fighters who claimed an allegiance to the separatist movement of Chechnya. They took 850 hostages and demanded the withdrawal of Russian forces from Chechnya and an end to the Second Chechen War. The siege was officially led by Movsar Barayev. After a 2.5 day siege, Russian Spetsnaz forces pumped an unknown chemical, which was actually a narcotic gas, which is like a fentanyl-based gas, into the building's ventilation system. And then they raided it. Officially, 39 of the terrorists were killed by the Russian forces, and then along with at least 129 of the people in there, there were the hostages, actually 9, including there were 9 of those were foreigners, died from the toxic substance that was pumped into that room. So they weren't shot; they died from the gas that the Russian special forces pumped into the room. There was some accounts of like people were in there and they're like, "Oh my gosh, we're gonna die," and they could see this gas starting getting pumped in through the AC system, and they're like, "Oh my gosh!" And then the Chechnyans some of them had gas masks, and so they put their gas masks on. Others didn't, and everybody was freaking out. And the Russians like let it pump in for like maybe 2 hours or so. Then they just walked in. There was a small gunfire from those Chechens that had gas masks, but they got eliminated pretty quickly. And then they just walked around and shot everybody that was that was Chechnyan, the 40 to 50 guys that were taken hostages. And then,
but over 100 of the hostages died.
129 hostages died because when they slumped over or when they fell back, their necks and their tongues were like positioned weirdly, so they just suffocated. And so they like brought out all these bodies. They just brought out all these bodies, passed out 800 people, passed out bodies, dead bodies, and they just laid them out on the sidewalk in front of the theater. And many of them were dead. 129 were dead. There was a doctor that the Moscow Health Committee chairman announced that all but one of the hostages killed in the raid had died from effects of the unknown gas rather than from gunshot wounds. And this is, you'll remember this from our Chernobyl episodes, that the cause of death listed for all hostages was declared to be, quote, terrorism, unquote, claiming that they died from heart attacks or other physical ailments.
Yeah.
Not from the gas that the special forces pumped in there and suffocated half of these people when they passed out. Or not half, 129 of them. Women and children. And actually 2 Spetsnaz forces, two soldiers actually died too from gas when they stormed in. So, classic, like, what does they say for like Chernobyl? Oh, only 40 people have actually died from the Chernobyl accident, So I thought that was kind of crazy, and also like kind of a failure on the part of, the Russian forces going in and just killing half the people. And one of the things in the hostage, the Iranian hostage crisis, and in the movie there was a scene where they're like, "Oh, the Russians would have been invading Iran by now," And it's like, well, the Russians would just bomb the whole building and kill everybody.
Screw them, yeah.
Screw all the hostages, just kill everybody. So, anyway,
I had one other one that was kind of interesting. So this one, I read it, and it's not meant to be, but I read it. It was kind of comical, so maybe this will be a good ending to that sad story. So, this was a Canadian Imperial of Commerce bank robbery. So on May 10th of 1973, a man wearing a black balaclava
What is
ski
that?
mask
Oh,
entered into the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce, and he was armed with a rifle, a pistol, and a homemade bomb consisting of 6 sticks of dynamite. So he had rigged this system up where he had a dead man's trigger switch that he held in between his teeth that would detonate the bomb if he opened his mouth.
how
a
is he going to
certain
talk and give
amount.
instructions?
I don't know. Maybe like in the side of his mouth.
Is it
or something.
ventriloquist or something?
Yeah,
Give
yeah. I don't
me
know.
the money.
So he demanded his bag, 3 duffel bags, be filled with money, and there was a police officer there who was actually, he was an undercover officer. His name was Don Millard, and he actually volunteered. He was in the bank, and he volunteered to be the guy's getaway driver for the truck. And he was like, "Oh, I'll be your getaway driver," And it kind of, I don't know, maybe if he kind of was like joining in with him, or if he, but he kind of saw an opportunity to get involved and potentially help the situation.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the guy was waving around the gun, fill up the bags, all that kind of stuff. And so they get all the money, and the criminal, the hostage taker, he ran out of the bank with this he didn't know, but
Mhm.
with this undercover police officer, and they both had these big duffel bags full of money,
Yeah.
and they were running out of the bank. And as soon as they got out of the front door, a police sniper shot the robber, which killed him, and it triggered the bomb to go off.
Mm-hmm.
And it went off right next to the undercover police officer, but they were holding these big duffel bags full of money, and so it killed the it killed the hostage criminal, the hostage taker,
Mm-hmm.
right? But because the police officer was kind of shielded by this big duffel bag of money,
Mhm.
he only had like minor injuries.
Oh, really?
And so, after this explosion happened, the police officer got up and he was kind of okay, and over $100,000 of cash was raining down in the streets
Oh my gosh.
of the city. And I thought it was interesting because at the end of the article it said, and virtually all of which was returned. So
Yeah.
almost all of it was returned.
Well,
right?
I'm sure some
I
of
guess
us have
some
blown to
probably got burned
smithereens.
up.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I just thought it was kind of interesting. I mean, it's like that's just
Dead
one
man's
of
trigger on your
those
teeth?
things that-
Yeah, that's interesting.
yeah, and then he runs out and then he gets shot and then the whole thing blows up and money's going everywhere, and the police officer that was tricking him was involved, but he was okay. And I don't know, it seemed like something Liam Neeson would get into.
Yeah, they should have got their juggernaut suits like those other guys did when we talked about the Rampage episode.
Yeah. So, well, this has been these stories are interesting. This is history too. This is stuff that
it shapes
happened.
and it shapes the world around us if you think about it. I mean, these DB Cooper, that was pre 9/11, and that happened. Those kind of airplane hostage situations, that was a common thing, and that really was kind of the impetus for starting this, like the TSA and all these airline checks.
That was
and
one
stuff.
of the main things that kind of started a lot more airport security and with airlines.
And like, yeah, I mean, there's so many. These situations are not totally uncommon. And like the Iranian, I mean, this affects American. I mean, these Americans. I mean, there's hostages taken every year, so something to be aware of when you're traveling. We have a personal. Our oldest sister, Vanessa, she knew someone who went to Mexico, and the guy was taken hostage when he went to go across he was in Cancun. He went across the street to a little tienda, taken hostage by these guys, and he spoke Spanish, so he ended up convincing them that he didn't have any money and that he was just there with his family. They took him, dropped him off, let him go. But yeah, it's just you gotta be careful.
Yeah, that's crazy.
So. Well, thanks for
All
joining,
right, well-
guys. This has been fun, just kind of exploring these fun stories in history. Be careful out there, and let's build that creed together.
All right, let's do it.